Speaking of nut jobs, do you remember Naomi Wolf when she was actually like a scholar before something happened? I mean, she
worked for Clinton.
Yes.
In the Clinton White House. Yeah.
And she was a well-regarded feminist writer. And then sometime during the late Bush years, she became really, and I remember interviewing her around that time, like unhealthily convinced that we were falling into a fascist state. And then it was off to the races. She had multiple sort of like scandals about her academic work, and is now like a full-on anti-vaxxer.
And just to talk just quickly touch on anxiety related to anti-vaxxers. If you're like maybe having that kind of extreme anxiety about a fascist state that doesn't seem proportional to reality, like you can understand some of the underlying, I think, ways that this conversation is pushed forward by people who might like be a little obsessive in certain areas.
It's like the government's coming for you and don't trust anything that they endorse or brand. And big pharma too, by the way. And, socialism and rabbit hole.
This is the type of person that Tucker Carlson has on his show. People who espouse, conspiracy theories and whatnot. And she is the latest guest on Tucker Carlson.
That is gone, and they've deconstructed it. And so now it's all about, like, what are the infection rates? Who's to blame? Are the red states to blame? Are the bikers to blame? Instead, we should be going back to American values in which we are responsible for ourselves. Sometimes there are medical crises, typhus, cholera, AIDS, polio, but we don't moralize it. We just get through it, and everyone keeps...
She just said... We don't moralize in relation to, of all of those ones, the ones that sticks out most blatantly, the AIDS. You're right. There was no moralizing during the AIDS crisis by the right wing in this country. The Reagan administration's entire non-response to AIDS was because they derisively called it, what was it, the gay plague or the gay flu? And then they would often say, oh, well, or at least that was from the Reagan administration. And I believe, I forget who, I read these unearthed like transcripts and documents of it recently. And then, of course, the entire right wing discourse around it was, well, these are drug addicts who deserved it because they used filthy needles. And the only way that you're a woman and you get AIDS is if you slept with a bisexual man. Gross. And so you probably deserved it and you were probably promiscuous. The entire response to AIDS was a moralizing political response, lack of response.
And I'm sorry, I am quite sure that many of those those potential epidemics, I guess, there was a ton of moralizing. Do your duty.
Here's a case study about typhoid. Typhoid and the politics of public health in 19th century Philadelphia. Lincoln and Steffens describes Philadelphia as corrupt and contented. The city's failure to provide clean water for its residents and the consequent continuation of widespread typhoid fever epidemics into the 20th century reinforced Philadelphia's bad image. Kind of like red state, blue state, that sort of thing. Other cities had managed to solve their water problems earlier, and therefore it seems fair to ask why Philadelphians delayed funding the filtration system that would ultimately end a citywide typhoid epidemic.
And I'm quite convinced that with all communicable diseases, there is an element of you must take responsibility to either from a public policy standpoint, make sure you have clean water, make sure that there's plumbing, make sure that people aren't taking craps in the streets type of situation. So what she's saying is completely ahistorical and made up. But go back because that's her jam.
Values in which we are responsible for ourselves. Sometimes there are medical crises, typhus, cholera, AIDS, polio, but we don't moralize it. We just get through it, and everyone keeps the laws and their rights intact.
You're from San Francisco. You went to the famous Lowell High School in San Francisco. You're very much a product of that city. Wonderful city.
And what are you, Tucker?
Which was the epicenter of the AIDS epidemic in 81, 82, 83, and, for 40 years. We self-consciously didn't do that.
Thank you.
And I'm glad. I mean, I don't, blaming people who are dying, it's like the ugliest thing you could do. Hepatitis, which killed an awful lot of people, spread primarily through.
Tucker Carlson knows enough that that was literally the cri de coeur of the Reagan administration.
Yeah.
It's their fault. Also, when they weren't literally laughing.
I mentioned San Francisco. Tucker Carlson, remember in his yearbook, had the Dan White Society listed as one of his alumni, along with the Jesse Helms Foundation.
Yep.
Dan White is the guy who shot Harvey Milk. Continue.
And I'm glad. I mean, I don't, blaming people who are dying, it's like the ugliest thing you could do. Hepatitis, which killed an awful lot of people, is spread primarily through sharing needles. We don't do it there either. Why?
Pause it 1 second.
What?
The idea that there hasn't been an enormous resistance to clean needle programs in this country is just, I don't know. It's like saying that there's no gravity. I mean, this has been for decades. There has been enormous resistance to clean needle programs. I mean,
even with Democrats, there has.
Yes.
Yeah. And especially with conservatives.
Across the board.
Yeah.
Across the board.
The moral majority back in the 80s had a headline called on the Moral Majority Report. Someone tweeted this at me and I just looked it up to confirm it. Homosexual diseases threaten American families. That's just like an example of the kind of lack of moralizing that was happening during that time.
Good.
Hepatitis, which killed an awful lot of people, is spread primarily through sharing needles. We don't do it there either. Why now?
Well, because if you don't moralize it, you can't gain control over an entire free society.
Dumb question.
No, these are the questions that should be being asked. And I think the AIDS crisis, the HIV crisis, is a perfect model of how different the expectations are now, because I remember that time well. I was, a young woman in a city. And people were learning about this very scary disease.
AIDS was sexually transmitted, not by air.
Yeah. And weren't there people back then refusing to wear condoms in a bit of a anti-masks?
I don't know that became a political movement. Right. I mean, I think, there was, if anything, the to the extent that there was movement, it was people, sort of
demonizing gay people.
Well, yes. And but I mean, in terms of the condom front, more people started wearing condoms.
Yeah.
But I don't think there was, nobody's there in the moment in which you're using those. I mean, somebody's there, but not.
I'm going to make a
not more than one person. But
there were like some sociopaths who started to, but that had nothing to do with politics. It just had to do with.
Yeah. All right. Well,
that woman.
That's yeah, but that's not. That's not a movement. There, and you find some outlier, one person. We have massive data. We have governors preventing people from wearing masks. But the idea that this has all been about government control, this is the thing that gets propagated, because this is the foundation to all the anti-mask and anti-vaccine conspiracy theories. And so you could say, I am against the authoritarian impulse here. That what this college is doing, what this governor is doing, what this mayor is doing is like the response to 9/11 when we started to spy on Muslim people. We created a security theater. This is just absurd. The idea that like first off, why deploy a vaccine? Why say that it is effective at that point. Like why would we see death rates going down? It doesn't, none of this tracks with that fundamental building block of this is an exercise by governments to train people to be authoritarian. It is, and you hear people like, a lot of it gets disseminated on that show from people who are ostensibly of the left, who are worried about the authoritarianism. And it is patently absurd. There is no logic to what they are expecting. Like the idea that now we're all vaccinated. I mean, I get the idea that look, this is made up by the pharmaceutical companies to make a ton of money. But why do they have a vaccine in Cuba?
Yeah, and
why do they have a vaccine in Cuba?
And the authoritarianism point, I've got to make this because I almost forgot to. Branko Markotić wrote this in Jacobin about Hitler and the Nazis' stances on compulsory vaccinations, because you hear this on the right wing. Oh, this is just like Hitler. Okay, for example, Hitler actually was in favor of compulsory vaccines, but only for Germans and white Germans, because they thought that the disease, it would be more effective if it spread amongst people, and they wanted to preserve vaccinations for as a part of their genocidal goals. So there is a complete ahistoricism when you're talking about the fascist designs of this government and trying to save people in the middle of a pandemic. In fact, the biggest example we have of fascist authoritarianism in the 20th century, they were in favor of vaccinations, but only for the select few as a part of a larger genocidal project.
Well, but even now, it's like with the inequity of distribution of vaccines. I mean, that's another case in point. Look through into entire continent of Africa, impoverished countries, they're still having issues dispersing them in a timely way, in a safe way, so that they're actually being distributed. It just doesn't make any sense. I mean, then you look at the other one. It's like this, the monitoring. When I open up my Facebook page, God forbid I do that ever again. And some guy I went to high school with does this entire rant, and he has 350 comments on it. It's just a random person, right? This isn't somebody who's a famous. And it's all about, they're still doing the chip thing. It's still part of the conversation. So if it's not about a pharmaceutical, the 5G chip, whatever it is, they're
and the magnet stuff. Yes, no, of course. But the point is that the way that you cannot get to 5G, you cannot get to masks are, affecting your neurology. You cannot get there without the first sort of building block of this is authoritarianism.
Right. But so that's what I'm saying is if it's not about health, then they conveniently have another excuse for the people who are not, the pharma excuse doesn't work. The authoritarianism pharma excuse, it goes to they're spying on us, they're monitoring. They have every base covered for the type of conspiracy theorists that they want to bring in and select.
Or how about it hasn't gotten full approval? Now it has full approval. Oh, well, I mean, not all of them, not all three. The mRNA is changing your DNA. Well, what about the separate technology in the Johnson & Johnson one? Oh, well, I mean, I'm not in favor of that for some. There's nothing. There's the next layer is just the next excuse they can cook.
Again, but I keep repeating myself, but the important thing I think is the thing that they all will say, ultimately, it comes back to this concept of authoritarianism. It is because without that, it's just sort of why? Right? All the variants of the conspiracy theories, it magnetizes you. It does this and that, or all the fears. There has to be a fundamental reason as to why someone would do this.
Yeah.
And it doesn't matter what the ill effects are. The motivation all has to boil down to some sort of nebulous notion of authoritarianism. And because that's the only thing that I guess, you could say Cuba and the United States. I mean, different elite, but Matt, go ahead.
Oh, I mean, I was just going to make my point that this is all to distract from the real coercion that's going on in society right now, which is we're not going to extend the eviction moratorium. We're going to cancel out unemployment benefits. Maybe we'll do something about student loans, maybe not, but maybe you should look for a job in the meantime, just in case.
Right. If this was about, asserting control, why wouldn't you or at least controlled by the state, why wouldn't you just extend unemployment benefits?
Yeah.
Like, why not? Why wouldn't you double and triple them?
Take people out of the...
I mean, it's like, so is Joe Manchin really the freedom fighter here? I'm fighting back against the authoritarian control because we need to have a rewarding mentality, not an entitlement mentality. I mean, it is complete and utter BS. Folks, there's more of what you've just saw where that came from. That's if you hit the subscribe and like button. Thank you. Really, thank you.